Still struggling. The question delivered by my brother sliced through the holiday cheer. For years, I was the family's creative one, the daughter who never quite measured up to the Hayes legacy. At 32, the familiar pity in my mother's eyes and the condescension in my brother's voice felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I'd spent a decade building an empire in silence, and now at this very table, a single news report was about to reveal everything. What happens when the family embarrassment turns out to be a secret billionaire? My name is Lauren Hayes, and for most of my life I was the family embarrassment. The creative one, the drifter, the daughter who never quite lived up to her potential. Behind those polite labels was the truth they saw me as a failure. The Hayes family was known for legacy. My father, Robert Hayes, built Hayes & Company, a financial empire worth billions, his face once gracing the cover of Forbes. My brother Ethan inherited his ambition and his arrogance. He became the golden boy, the natural successor. I was the side note, the black sheep with big ideas and little results. I used to think their approval mattered. I used to cry in my car after family dinners, promising myself that next year I'd finally make them proud. But that year never came. Not the way they expected. When I left Boston for Seattle 12 years ago, I told them I was joining a small fintech startup. The truth was, I was founding my own. Echelon AI. A company built on algorithms I'd written in my one-bedroom apartment, fueled by late-night coffee cheap takeout and a desperation so fierce it felt like survival. My family thought I was chasing a fantasy. Maybe I was. But even fantasies can turn into empires when you stop asking for permission. The dinner that night at my parents' mansion in Brookline was everything I remembered and everything I'd sworn I'd outgrown. White candles in silver holders, fine china that only saw the light twice a year, and the smell of rosemary turkey wafting through the air. The dining room gleamed like a shrine to control everything perfect, everything expensive, everything suffocating. Mom insisted on hosting the traditional family Christmas dinner, her way of pretending we were still close. Dad, recently retired, sat at the head of the table on a man who measured success by the sharpness of your suit and the size of your portfolio. Ethan, as always, played the role of dutiful son. His wife, Madison, never missed a chance to remind me of her Ivy League pedigree. I hadn't planned to come. But when the invitation arrived embossed in gold, something in me stirred. A curiosity. Maybe even defiance. The same reason I'd agreed to the Forbes interview 2 weeks earlier. If they were going to talk about me behind my back, I wanted them to do it while looking me in the eyes. "Lauren, darling, you look healthy," Mom said. Her tone a strange blend of surprise and condescension. Translation, she'd expected me to look poor. "Thanks, Mom." "You too," I replied, sliding into the empty seat at the far end of the table across from Ethan. He eyed my outfit, a simple navy dress, nothing flashy. "Still keeping it minimalist, huh?" "It's comfortable," I said. He smirked. "Comfortable's another word for broke." Dad chuckled softly, sipping his scotch. "Now, Ethan, no need to tease your sister." But there was no real reprimand in his voice. He was proud of his son's confidence, the same kind he once wielded like a weapon. The conversation turned to business as it always did. Ethan boasted about the company's stock performance, the new acquisition in London, his strategic vision for the future. Dad beamed at every word. When they paused long enough to breathe, Mom turned to me. "And how's work?" "Dear, it's good. Busy." "What will you do again?" Madison chimed in, her smile tight. "Something with apps, artificial intelligence," I said. "Predictive modeling, risk assessment." "Oh," she said, blinking like I'd spoken another language. "So, still doing the computer thing?" "Still. That word. Always that word." Dinner dragged on in waves of polite cruelty. Questions designed to sound casual but cut deep. Every comparison was a reminder that I'd strayed too far from the Hayes blueprint. When dessert arrived, I was exhausted. I watched my family laugh, clinking glasses, utterly unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to shift forever. The news anchor's voice rose from the muted TV. Dad always kept it on during dinner, a habit he never broke. The anchor's tone was crisp, professional, but even she sounded intrigued. "Breaking news tonight. Forbes confirms that the new majority shareholder and CEO of Hayes & Company is none other than Robert Hayes' daughter, Lauren Hayes. Mom gasped, her glass slipping from her hand, shattering across the marble floor. Red wine bled into the white linen like a wound. Ethan froze mid-smirk, his mouth hanging open. Dad's face went pale, then flushed, his jaw tightening as if trying to form words that refused to come. I sat perfectly still. The flames from the fireplace danced in the reflection of my wineglass. "Well," I said softly, "I guess we can finally talk about business." No one spoke. The only sound was the slow dripping of wine off the edge of the table. That night, after the chaos, after the questions, and the stunned silence, I stood outside on the porch, snow falling in delicate flakes around me. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but for the first time in years I felt warm inside. It wasn't the thrill of power or the satisfaction of revenge. It was something deeper. Freedom. For years I'd let their judgment define me. I'd built a company in secret, not to prove them wrong, but to finally prove something to myself, that I was enough without their validation. Tomorrow the Forbes cover will be everywhere. But tonight, under the falling snow, it was just me. The girl who once cried in her car after Christmas dinner. The woman who now owned the company that built her father's name. And somewhere faintly I could almost hear Karma whispering back, "Merry Christmas, Lauren." The morning after that dinner, the world woke up to my face on the cover of Forbes. I didn't need to check, my phone was already buzzing nonstop, a relentless stream of notifications lighting up the dark hotel room. Lauren Hayes, the stock market's most private billionaire CEO, the headline read. Beneath it, a photo of me standing in the glass corridor of Echelon Tower, calm, composed, untouchable. For a moment, I just sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the glowing screen, hearing my own breath. The city outside was still half asleep, streets wet with the remnants of last night's snow. I'd imagined this day 1,000 times. I thought I'd feel victorious, maybe even vengeful. Instead, I just felt still, like I'd finally reached the end of a very long road and wasn't sure what came next. The first call came from my assistant, Marion. Her voice was trembling with excitement. "Lauren, it's everywhere. Bloomberg, CNBC, The Wall Street Journal. They're calling you the silent shark of fintech. You've got requests from investors, speaking invitations, offers. God, you're trending on Twitter." "Of course I am," I said quietly. "What about the board?" "They're thrilled," she said. "Mostly stunned, but thrilled. Everyone wants a comment." I smiled faintly. Let them wait. Sometimes silence says more than statements. As I hung up, the second call came through from a number I hadn't seen in years. I stared at the screen. Home. For the first time since I'd left Boston, I let it go to voicemail. By noon, the story had spread like wildfire. Social media was a feeding frenzy. Analysts dissected every sentence from the Forbes piece, my company's valuation. The mystery of my anonymity, the revelation that the so-called missing daughter of Robert Hayes was now one of the richest women in tech. And then came the photos. My brother's face frozen mid-smirk at the dinner table, captured by someone's phone when the news broke. My mother's hand clutching her wineglass, eyes wide. The captions were merciless. When the tables turn. Karma served cold. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. By the time the afternoon sunlight cut across my hotel suite, I'd already received over 100 interview requests. But I only opened one email, the one from Forbes editor Rachel Kim. Subject: "You did it." Body: "I warned them, you were bigger than they realized." Let's talk about the follow-up feature. They want, from family outcast to fintech queen. I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting out a slow exhale. I didn't want to be a queen. I just wanted peace. That evening, Marion came to the suite. She'd been with me since Echelon's first cramped office, a mentor turned confidant, sharp as glass but loyal as steel. She carried a bottle of champagne under one arm and 2 cups of takeout noodles in the other. "Congratulations," she said, setting everything down on the table. "You did it, kid. You burned down their little empire of judgment." I laughed softly. "You make it sound like arson." "It is," she said, sitting across from me. Only this time the fire made you stronger. We ate in silence for a while, the city lights flickering beyond the window. Marion finally broke it. What now? Now, I said, we act like nothing's changed. She raised a brow. Lauren, you just became the face of an $11 billion empire. Everything's changed. Not for me, I said. I still have code to review, contracts to finalize. We have a product launch in February. She smiled faintly. And your family, I paused, looking down at the uneaten noodles. They'll adjust. They always do. 2 days later, I drove back to my parents' estate, not for closure, but for clarity. The long driveway, the columns, the frozen pond. It all looked smaller now. Or maybe I had simply grown too much to fit back inside the walls that once contained me. James, the old butler, opened the door. His eyes softened when he saw me. Miss Lauren, congratulations. Thank you, James, I said. How are they? He hesitated. In shock mostly. I figured. Inside, the air was thick with the kind of silence that follows a storm. Mom was in the sitting room, her posture perfect as always, a cup of untouched tea trembling slightly in her hand. Dad stood near the fireplace, staring at the framed Forbes cover, now sitting on the mantel. Ethan wasn't there yet. Lauren, Mom said, voice delicate as porcelain. We didn't realize. No, I said gently. You didn't want to realize. Dad turned. His face was unreadable. Why didn't you tell us? Because you would have stopped me, I said simply. You would have called it reckless. You would have reminded me of everything I wasn't. Mom looked wounded. We were just trying to guide you. You were trying to mold me, I corrected, into something that fit this house. The silence that followed was thick, brittle, and final. Then the sound of the front door slammed open and Ethan appeared. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes tie askew. Well, well, he said, voice laced with sarcasm. The prodigal daughter returns. You could have given us a heads up before hijacking Dad's company. I didn't hijack anything, I said evenly. I bought it, legally. You can check the filings. Using what Pity shares, he snapped. Or did you charm the board? Neither, I said. I earned it. His laugh was sharp. You always did love your underdog story. Dad intervened. That's enough, Ethan. Ethan scoffed. No, it's not. She embarrassed this family on national television. I looked at him, really looked. The arrogance was still there, but underneath it was something else, fear. Fear of being replaced. You embarrassed yourself, I said quietly. All I did was build what you never thought I could. He clenched his jaw, then stormed out of the room. The sound of the door slamming echoed like a punctuation mark in the past. That night I stayed at a small inn on the edge of town. I couldn't sleep. The snow outside glowed under the streetlights, and I thought about everything that had led me here. The nights in my cramped apartment, the endless code reviews, the rejection emails, the silence of investors who couldn't take a young woman seriously. I thought about Dad's face when he read that Forbes article. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something softer. Pity, maybe. Understanding, even. Because I finally saw what they couldn't success had never been about proving them wrong. It was about proving that I could live without their approval. Around 3 a.m., I opened my laptop and began typing. A press release draft. Subject echelon AI. Expands to new frontiers in ethical finance. I wasn't done yet. The world knew my name now, but I wanted them to know my purpose. By morning, the roads were clear. I checked out, loaded my bag into the car, and headed back toward the city. Halfway down the interstate, my phone rang. Marion again. You're not going to believe this, she said. Forbes just called. They're adding a new section to your article, something about leadership and humility. They're calling it the Hayes Effect. I laughed, a real one this time. The Hayes Effect. That's rich. They want a quote, she said. Tell them this, I said, eyes on the snowy horizon. Success isn't revenge. It's freedom. Marion was quiet for a moment. You really mean that? I do, I said, and I think I finally understand it. As the city skyline came into view, sunlight cut through the clouds like a promise. Somewhere out there, Forbes readers were debating, my story analysts were speculating on my next move, and my family was sitting in silence, realizing they'd underestimated the wrong person. But none of that mattered now. The game was over. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing to win. I was playing to build something that would outlast all of us. The emails started pouring in before dawn, offers, invitations, flattery dressed as opportunity. Everyone wanted a piece of me now. Venture capital firms, university boards, even politicians who'd once ignored my existence were suddenly eager to align their brands with the woman who outsmarted Wall Street. I didn't reply to any of them. My inbox had turned into noise, and I'd learned long ago that silence could be the sharpest reply of all. At 8 a.m., Marion called from the office. "They've been outside since 6, she said. CNN, CNBC, Fox, even Forbes again. I told them you're not available." "Good," I said, slipping on my coat. "Let's keep it that way." When I arrived at Echelon Tower, the front steps were flooded with reporters. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. I pushed through, quietly escorted by 2 security guards, ignoring the questions flying at me about my father, my brother, my so-called revenge. Everyone wanted to know how it felt to humiliate my own family on live television. But I hadn't humiliated anyone. I'd simply revealed the truth they'd chosen to ignore. Inside, the elevator doors closed, muting the chaos. Marion stood waiting on the top floor, holding a folder of investor summaries. "You're trending again," she said, following me into my office. "I didn't ask about trends." "No one ever does," she replied. The city sprawled beneath the window's steel glass motion. It used to overwhelm me. Now it steadied me. This view wasn't just a reward. It was proof of how far I'd come since the nights I coded from a folding chair, living on instant noodles and caffeine. But the glow of success had its shadows. The Forbes article had lit a fire I couldn't fully control. Stock prices surged, analysts speculated, and investors began questioning Hayes & Company's future under my partial ownership. Some called me a genius. Others called me a threat. Both were true. By noon, Marion had arranged a private lunch meeting with our lead investor, Thomas Riley, a man who'd believed in me back when no one else did. We met in a quiet corner booth overlooking the harbor. He lifted his glass. "Congratulations, Lauren. You've changed the game." "Or just rewrote the rules," I said. He chuckled. "Forbes doesn't crown many people twice in 1 year. You've earned it." I sipped my water, studying him. "What's the catch, Thomas?" "You didn't come here just to celebrate." He smiled knowingly. "The board is nervous. They think your family drama might affect investor confidence. They want reassurance that Echelon won't become a battleground." "It won't," I said. "You're sure about that?" he asked. "Because the market doesn't like emotion. It likes control." I leaned back. "Thomas, I've built this company from nothing but emotion, anger, hope, fear. If control was all it took, Hayes & Company wouldn't be begging for a bailout." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's exactly why you'll win." Back at the office, Marion handed me a thick envelope. "This came by courier. From your father's lawyer." I froze. "What is it?" "Looks like a notice," she said. I opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter written in cold, polished legal language. My father's attorney requested a meeting regarding the reallocation of family holdings and estate concerns. Translation: "They're trying to take something back." I laughed under my breath. "Of course. The empire doesn't crumble without one last fight." Marion frowned. "Do you want me to set the meeting?" "Yes," I said, "but on my terms, my office, my schedule." "Got it." When she left, I stared out the window again. The city lights flickered against the gray sky, and for the first time since dinner, I felt the weight of what I'd done, not guilt exactly, but gravity. Every choice had a cost. Every silence a price. I'd stayed quiet for years, building in the dark, letting their laughter roll off my back. But silence could be a weapon. It could build, it could protect, and when the moment was right, it could strike. Now it was striking back at them. That evening my phone rang again. "Ethan." I let it ring twice before answering. "What do you want?" "You made your point," he said, his tone low and tired. "You embarrassed all of us." Congratulations. I didn't embarrass you, Ethan. I exposed the truth. The truth, he snapped. That you've been sitting in Dad's company like a vulture buying up shares while he got sick. Don't twist this, I said sharply. You know I didn't steal anything. I invested when you weren't paying attention. When you were too busy golfing with board members to notice the house burning. He went silent for a long moment. You really think this makes you better than us? No, I said. It just makes me free. He laughed bitterly. Free? You're chained to the same thing you've always wanted, our approval. Don't pretend you did this for justice. I didn't, I said. I did it because someone had to fix what you broke. Then you're no different from Dad, he said coldly and hung up. I sat there for a while staring at the dead line. The words lingered like smoke, no different from Dad. Maybe that was true. Maybe we were both trying to prove something. He built Hayes & Company out of ambition. I built Echelon out of defiance. Either way, we'd both sacrificed pieces of ourselves for power. The next day, I walked into the boardroom at Echelon Tower. The walls of glass reflected the skyline like a mirror-cold, beautiful distant. My team waited in silence. Marion stood by the projector, the latest figures on display. Revenue is up 40% since the Forbes feature, she said. Investors are pouring in. You're now the largest female shareholder in 3 major tech sectors. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Marion caught my expression. You're not celebrating. I'm thinking, I said. About what? About how easy it is to lose yourself once everyone starts calling you brilliant. She tilted her head. You've been underestimated your whole life. Let them call you brilliant for once. I smiled faintly. The thing about being underestimated, Marion, it keeps you honest. That night I found myself walking the empty streets near the waterfront. Snow flurries drifted in the cold wind, catching in the streetlights like falling stars. I pulled my scarf tighter, letting the cold sting my skin awake. I'd won, yes. But victories like this don't come clean. They come with echoes, with ghosts of the past that whisper every time you try to breathe easy. Somewhere behind the glass towers and flashing headlines, my family was crumbling. The empire my father built was being restructured under my name. And though part of me wanted to revel in that poetic justice, another part of me, quieter, older, felt the ache of what had been lost. Silence had protected me for years, but it had also cost me something I could never reclaim: connection. As I stood there, watching the city lights ripple across the frozen harbor, I realized the truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. In the pursuit of proving them wrong, I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be right with myself. And somewhere deep down, a small, fragile part of me wondered if freedom was ever really free. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a courier wearing a suit too crisp for ordinary business. I already knew what it was before I opened it. My father never sent letters, only summons. The Hayes family didn't request meetings. They commanded attendance. The envelope was thick, embossed with the family crest. Inside a single page in my father's sharp, precise handwriting, Lauren, it's time we talked properly. Dinner at the house this Sunday. No press, no theatrics, just family. Dad. I stared at the note for a long moment before folding it neatly back into the envelope. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him stew in his own pride, to remind him that he'd lost the right to command me years ago. But curiosity, that old ghost, whispered otherwise. Marion caught the look on my face when she stepped into my office. Another olive branch, she asked dryly. More like a trap wrapped in stationery, I said. You're not actually thinking of going, are you? I am, I said. But not as the daughter who left. This time, I will be the CEO who owns the table. Sunday came cold and sharp, the kind of winter day where the air stung your lungs and everything smelled like frost. The Hayes estate sat at the edge of Brookline, like an old cathedral of wealth-perfect symmetry, iron gates, marble steps. It hadn't changed. But I had. James the butler opened the door with his usual calm professionalism. Miss Lauren, he greeted. It's good to see you again. Thank you, James. I wasn't sure if they'd told you I was coming. Oh, they did? He said, eyes flicking briefly with amusement. It's all anyone's been talking about. The living room looked like a museum exhibit, fire crackling silverware gleaming, a Christmas wreath still hanging even though it was mid-January. My mother sat on the couch, posture impeccable, eyes shadowed. My father stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Lauren," he said, turning toward me. His voice was calm, controlled, but the faint strain beneath it betrayed everything. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," I said lightly. He ignored the jab. "Please, sit." I did. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unsaid things. My mother finally broke it. "You look tired, dear." "I've been busy," I said. "So we've seen," my father said. "You've made quite the spectacle." "I didn't make anything," I said. "Forbes did." His eyes narrowed. "Don't get clever. I learned from the best." For a second, something flickered across his face. Anger, pride, maybe even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You've embarrassed this family," he said quietly. "Whatever you think you've accomplished, the world now sees us as divided. That matters, Lauren. Appearances matter. They always did it to you," I said. "More than people ever did." My mother flinched. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I said. "You cared more about the stock portfolio than the people running it. You cared about control, the company, the image, not about your daughter sleeping in her office when she couldn't afford rent." My father's jaw tightened. "You made your choices. And I built something better with them," I said. "Better?" His voice sharpened. "You think what you've done, stealing shares going behind our backs, makes you better. I didn't steal anything," I said evenly. "You sold those shares when the market dipped. I bought them legally. It's not my fault you underestimated me." The room went still. My mother's eyes darted between us like she was watching two storms collide. Finally, he said, "You've always mistaken rebellion for strength. And you've always mistaken control for love," I said softly. For a long time, no one spoke. The fire popped, the only sound in the room. My father turned away, staring out the window toward the frozen garden. "Do you know what your problem is, Lauren?" he said. "You think success will fix what's broken inside you." I stood. "No," I said. "I know it won't. But at least it keeps me from becoming the kind of person who breaks others to feel whole." I left before dinner. The cold air hit my face like a slap as I stepped outside. Snow had started falling again, slow, silent flakes drifting down through the darkness. I walked to my car without looking back, my breath fogging in the air. As I reached the gate, I heard the door open behind me. "Lauren." It was Ethan. He jogged down the steps, coat half-buttoned, expression conflicted. "Wait." I turned. "What?" he hesitated. "I shouldn't have said what I did on the phone. You didn't deserve that. I've heard worse." He gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, I bet you have." He shoved his hands in his pockets. He's scared, you know. The company was his identity. You are taking over. It's like losing himself twice. I studied with him. And what about you? What's your excuse?" He looked down at the snow. "I spent my whole life trying to be him," he said quietly. "And then you showed up and became something else entirely. Something we don't know how to understand." "That's not my problem anymore," I said. "I know." He nodded slowly. "But maybe it could be different now." "Different how?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we stop pretending we hate each other." I stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "We don't hate each other, Ethan. We just grew up in a house that didn't leave room for love unless it came with conditions." He didn't respond. The snow kept falling quiet and endless. Finally, he said, "You're really not coming back, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm building something else now." He nodded, looking suddenly older. "Then make it count." "I already am." I got in my car, the headlights cutting through the falling snow as I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw Ethan still standing by the gate, watching until I disappeared from sight. Back at the hotel, the suite was quiet. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the snow blanket the city. Below, the lights shimmered across the harbor, reflections of a world that finally saw me, but not the way I used to crave. The phone buzzed again. Marion's name lit up the screen. "Everything okay?" she asked. I just came from the house, I said. It went as expected. Meaning nothing changed, I said. But I did. There was a pause. Then maybe that's enough. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Outside, the snow kept falling. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, no need to prove anything. Just a quiet certainty that I'd done what I had to do. The past could haunt me all it wanted. It just couldn't touch me anymore. The morning after that confrontation, my name was everywhere. Every financial network, every headline, every whisper on Wall Street seemed to circle back to me. Lauren Hayes, the woman who outsmarted an empire. From disgraced heiress to billionaire CEO, meet the stock market's most private powerhouse. It wasn't just a Forbes moment anymore. It had become a movement. Shares of Echelon AI surged 20% overnight, and investors flooded in like a rising tide. Everyone wanted a piece of the company, a share of the myth. At 8 a.m., Marion was waiting outside my office, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other. The press won't stop calling. Bloomberg wants an exclusive. The Wall Street Journal wants a photo shoot. And Forbes just sent flowers shaped like their logo. It's creepy. I smiled faintly. Send the flowers to the lobby. The interns will love them. Lauren, she said, following me inside. You're trending for the third straight day. People are obsessed with you. People are obsessed with what I represent, I corrected. Not me. Marion studied me over her glasses. And what exactly do you represent? The revenge they wish they had the courage to take, I said simply. By mid-morning, the stock ticker on my wall flashed in green. Echelon's valuation had just crossed $15 billion. My team was cheering down the hall, the kind of joy that usually only money can buy. But I didn't join them. I just watched the numbers climb, feeling a profound sense of quiet inevitability, the result of a decade of silent work. Congratulations, Marion said softly from the doorway. On what, I asked. You just became one of the top 20 richest women in America. I let out a breath. It's a strange kind of freedom, isn't it? I said. Knowing you finally earned something no one can take away. She frowned. Don't start that again. You earned every dollar of this, every headline, every late night. Every time they told you you'd fail, you turned it into fuel. I know, I said. But the fire that gets you here isn't the one that keeps you warm. It's just the beginning. That afternoon, I walked into the trading floor for the first time in years. The glass walls, the flashing screens, the frantic calls, it was chaos, disguised as precision. People looked up as I entered. Some smiled too widely. Others avoided my gaze altogether. A trader whispered, "That's her," as if I were a ghost walking through the living. At the far end of the room stood Paul Green, our head of global strategy. He was one of the first people to believe in my algorithms. A man who measured everything in data, never emotion. He greeted me with a tight handshake. The market loves you right now, Lauren. Markets are fickle, I said. They love stories more than truth. He smirked. Then let's give them both. He led me to a screen showing Echelon's live performance. You see that spike, he said, pointing at the line shooting upward. That's not just retail investors. That's institutional money. Hedge funds, pensions, sovereign wealth. Everyone wants in. And when the hype fades, I asked. He gave a small shrug. Then we'll still have what they don't substance. Your algorithms are the real story here, not the Forbes cover. Then let's make sure they remember that, I said. Later, I stood in the observation deck, watching Boston's skyline gleam beneath the winter sun. I remembered the girl who used to stare at these towers from a coffee shop across the river, dreaming of building something big enough to be seen from every window. Now I am here. And it felt like a different kind of victory, not one won against them, but one won for myself. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Nice performance, sis. Dad says the markets might finally take you seriously. Don't let it go to your head. E. I exhaled slowly. Of course. Ethan couldn't resist. I typed back, the markets don't take me seriously. They take results seriously. You should try it sometime. Then delete it before sending. Instead, I pocketed my phone and walked back to my office. Marion was waiting with a printout. "What's this?" I asked. "Something you should see," she said. "Your father's company, Hayes & Company, just filed for restructuring. Their stock dropped 8% after the Forbes story." I froze. "He's losing control." She nodded. "The board's panicking. There are rumors they might approach you about a merger. They think you can save them." A humorless smile tugged at my lips. "They never wanted my help before." "Well," she said, "they do now." That night I met Thomas Riley again, this time in a quiet rooftop bar overlooking the city. The air was sharp, the sky painted with streaks of amber and steel. "You've shaken up the market," he said, sipping his whiskey. "Hayes & Company can't survive another quarter without drastic change. They'll come to you hat in hand." "I know," I said. He tilted his glass toward me. "And you'll help them?" I looked out over the lights. "Help," I echoed. "No, I'll buy them." He smiled approvingly. "That's the move." "Not for revenge," I added. "For closure." He raised a brow. "Closure is just revenge with paperwork, Lauren." I didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Back at the office, I stayed late staring at the illuminated skyline beyond my window. The hum of computers filled the silence. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, powerful, calm, distant. I remembered my mother's words, the way she'd said, "Appearances matter." She wasn't entirely wrong. The world worships the image before it respects the person. I was done hiding. Opening my laptop, I began typing a statement for our next press release. Echelon AI announces plans to acquire a controlling stake in Hayes & Company, ensuring stability in legacy financial systems through innovative technology. A simple statement. Clean. Controlled. Ruthless. When I finished, I read it aloud. Ensuring stability. I almost laughed. Stability had never been the goal, it was transformation. I hit save. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft flakes swirling in the cold wind. I stood by the window watching the city blur beneath it. Somewhere in that maze of lights, my father was probably on the phone with his board. Ethan was likely drinking too much, and the Hayes legacy was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. But I wasn't that frightened girl anymore. I wasn't waiting for approval or permission or forgiveness. I was building something that didn't need their name. Something that could stand on its own, my empire, my way. The city below glimmered like a constellation, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. It felt inevitable. And when the markets opened in the morning, I knew exactly what would happen. The headlines would scream, the shares would surge, and the world would finally understand the Hayes dynasty was over, and the age of Lauren Hayes had just begun. By dawn, my decision was already moving through the veins of the market like electricity. The official press release went live at 7 a.m. sharp. Within minutes, Echelon AI acquires majority stake in Hayes & Company hit every financial wire and news feed from New York to London. The reactions were immediate. Hayes & Company stock spiked for exactly 6 minutes before crashing 10%. Analysts scrambled for explanations. The family firm my father had spent 40 years building an empire of deals, debt, and polished dinners was now a subsidiary of mine. When I arrived at the office, Marion was waiting outside the glass elevator with 2 coffees and a look that mixed awe with disbelief. "You really did it," she said quietly. "You bought your father's company." "No," I said, stepping past her. "I rescued it." The trading floor was chaotic, phones ringing, monitors flashing, traders shouting into headsets. For once, the noise didn't bother me. I'd caused it. I was it. Inside my office, the phone was already ringing. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I knew who it was. Lauren. My father's voice was cold, restrained. "Explain yourself." "It's called a hostile takeover," I said calmly. "But I prefer the term restructuring." "You humiliated me," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "Yes," I said. "It looks like a company being saved from collapse." He took a slow breath, the sound of control barely holding. "You're playing with fire. Then maybe it's time you stopped pretending you were the only one who knew how to handle the heat." There was silence. Then he said, "You think this makes you powerful?" "No," I said. "It makes me free." He hung up. By noon, the financial media had turned my decision into a spectacle. Bloomberg called it a generational power shift. CNBC ran a segment titled, "When the Daughter Becomes the CEO." Forbes, of course, published a follow-up, "The stock market's most private billionaire strikes again." The comment sections were full of admiration and venom in equal measure. Some hailed me as a visionary. Others called me cold, ruthless, ungrateful. I didn't read them for validation. I read them to measure the temperature of the public's obsession. They didn't know the truth. The years of silence, the dinners filled with judgment, the way my father once told me that some people are born to lead others to follow. Well, now the follower was writing the checks. Marion came in with the updated portfolio reports. "You've officially outperformed Hayes & Company's entire market record in 48 hours, she said. I nodded. "And the board half resigned. The other half are begging to stay. Keep the ones who beg," I said. "They know fear. Fear makes people efficient." She hesitated. "You sound like him." I looked up sharply. "Like who, your father?" she said. The tone, the words. The air between us thickened. I set the papers down, the clatter echoing in the sudden quiet. I saw it then, a truth I had been fighting for years, the cold, calculated efficiency, the ruthless logic, the very words I had just spoken. My father used fear to control people. Now I was using it to motivate them. He built an empire on arrogance. I had just taken it over with an even colder resolve. The victory for a moment didn't feel like mine. It felt like his. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the thought from my mind. Maybe Marion was right. Maybe power didn't change people. Maybe it just showed who they really were all along. And maybe in my quest for freedom, I had simply become a new version of the cage I'd always tried to break free from. That evening I held a private meeting at the Echelon Tower boardroom. The skyline burned orange as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Every major department head was there: finance, R&D, media relations. The atmosphere was charged, expectant. "This isn't just about acquisition," I said. "It's about evolution. Hayes & Company will be rebranded under Echelon's umbrella. We're merging legacy with innovation. The old systems will be replaced here." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the senior directors, Victor Hahn, cleared his throat. "Lauren, with all due respect, merging that fast could destabilize operations. The market's still volatile." I met his gaze. "Volatility is opportunity, Victor. The market doesn't reward hesitation." He hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." After the meeting, Marion lingered behind. "You were brilliant," she said. "But you scared them." "Good," I said. "Fear keeps things moving." She studied me for a long moment. "And what keeps you moving?" I didn't answer. Later that night, I went home to my penthouse overlooking the harbor. The city was alive beneath me, lights, flickering sirens wailing 1,000 stories unfolding at once. I poured a glass of whiskey, something my father would have approved of, and turned on the television. There he was, Robert Hayes, my father, sitting across from a CNBC anchor, his tie immaculate, his expression stoic. The anchor's voice was crisp. "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to lose control of your company to your daughter?" He smiled thinly. "I wouldn't call it losing control. Let's say I passed the torch." "Liar." "And your relationship with your daughter?" the anchor asked. He paused just long enough for the cameras to catch it. "Lauren is driven. She always has been. I suppose she finally found a way to prove it." I stared at the screen, my heart a slow, steady drum. He looked composed, but his eyes, the eyes I inherited, were sharp with resentment. Marion texted me moments later. "You saw it," I typed back. "Let him talk. The market's already on my side." But even as I sent it, I couldn't shake the weight pressing in my chest. Victory had never felt so lonely. The next morning, I met with the financial press for the first time since the takeover. A sleek conference room, glass walls, rows of cameras, microphones. Reporters waited, pens poised. One asked Ms. Hayes, "Was this personal?" I smiled faintly. "Everything in business is personal." Another leaned forward. "What would you say to critics who claim you've destroyed a family legacy?" I paused, letting the silence stretch. Legacies built on exclusion aren't worth preserving, I said finally. I didn't destroy anything. I rebuilt it. That quote made every headline. By evening, the stock had stabilized, the investors had calmed, and my company was stronger than ever. But as I walked through the quiet halls of Echelon Tower that night, I caught my reflection in the glass, sharp-polished distant. The skyline stared back, unforgiving and glittering. I saw my face in the reflection, not as the daughter of Robert Hayes or the rebellious outcast, but as a new kind of fortress, powerful, cold, and utterly alone. The wind outside howled through the skyscrapers, carrying the sound of the city like a whisper. And for the first time I wondered if in proving myself to them, I'd lost something I couldn't buy back, something like grace. But grace doesn't make the stock rise. And tomorrow, when the markets opened again, they wouldn't remember the silence. They'd remember the woman who turned a family name into an empire. The first sign of trouble came quietly, an email from compliance flagged urgent. No fanfare, no blinking alarms, just a subject line that made my stomach tighten: discrepancy in Hayes and Company filings. Immediate review required. By the time I finished reading, my coffee had gone cold. The numbers didn't add up. Somewhere inside the newly merged accounts, millions in liquidity had vanished. It wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Someone was bleeding the company from within. Marion appeared in my doorway a few minutes later, expression tense. "You saw it?" "Yes," I said. "Find out where it started." She nodded and closed the door behind her. For the first time since the takeover, the office felt hostile. Every click of a keyboard, every closed-door conversation sounded suspicious. Hayes and Company had been full of loyalist people who'd served my father, not the company. Now they served no one but themselves. By noon, Marion returned clutching a stack of printouts. "It's worse than we thought," she said. "Someone's been rerouting investment funds through a holding company in Zurich. Guess whose signature's on the authorization form?" I skimmed the papers. The name glared back at me. Ethan Hayes. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for a moment. It wasn't the signature that shocked me. It was the name. The name of the brother I had fought for, the boy I had once believed in. All the old wounds, all the years of feeling like the family outcast seemed to vanish, replaced by a wave of raw, unexpected pain. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another to be betrayed. I drove to the Hayes estate that night, headlights cutting through the mist curling over the long driveway. It was nearly midnight when I reached the house, but the lights were still on. My father never slept early. He treated rest as a form of weakness. James opened the door before I could knock. "Miss Lauren," he said softly. "Your brother's in the study." Perfect. The door was half open. Ethan sat behind our father's mahogany desk, drink in hand, scrolling through his phone like he owned the place. He didn't even look up when I stepped in. "Here for another lecture," he said. "Or are you here to gloat?" I shut the door behind me. "Where's the money, Ethan, that got his attention?" He looked up, smirking and fading. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. You rerouted the Zurich funds." He stood trying to match my height. "Those accounts were part of my division. I had every right to move that money." "You had the right," I said, "until you signed it under my company's name." He laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You think you can just waltz in, take everything, and expect me to hand over the scraps?" I stepped closer. "This isn't about scraps. This is about trust. Don't lecture me about ethics," he snapped. "You've been stealing from us for years. You just did it with lawyers." I could have yelled. I could have thrown those glass paperweights sitting on the desk. Instead, I looked at him, really looked, and saw what he'd become. Or maybe what he'd always been, a man raised on entitlement, choking on his own mediocrity. The anger drained away, leaving a hollowness so profound it ached in my chest. "You could have built something of your own," I said quietly, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But you chose to destroy mine." His expression hardened. "You took everything from this family, Lauren. You took him." "Dad," I said. "Dad doesn't need me to take him." He was gone long before I left. Ethan's jaw clenched. He reached for his drink instead of answering. "I'm giving you one chance," I said. "Return the money, quietly, before I make it public." He chuckled low and humorless. "You wouldn't dare." "You don't know me anymore," I said, turning toward the door. "Maybe not," he said. "But I know one thing, you've become exactly like him." That stopped me cold. I turned back, the anger sharp in my chest. "The difference between us, Ethan, is that I don't harm people to feel powerful." He smiled without warmth. "Are you sure about that?" The drive back to Boston was a blur of headlights and snow. By the time I reached my penthouse, the city was still asleep, but my mind was racing. The image of Ethan's smug face wouldn't leave me. At 4 a.m, Marion texted, "We traced the transfers. He's using offshore accounts to buy up Hayes & Company's shares. He's trying to take control back." I replied instantly, "Not happening." By sunrise, my legal team was in motion. Cease and desist letters went out. Compliance froze the accounts. Within 24 hours, every transaction under Ethan's name was blocked. But I wasn't celebrating. I'd started a war I couldn't retreat from. 2 days later, the Financial Post broke the story. Family feud. At Hayes Empire, insider trading allegations surface. The photo they chose for the article, me on the Forbes cover next to Ethan at some charity gala, was brutal. The caption read, "From power to paranoia." Marion burst into my office, phone in hand. "Lauren, they're running it everywhere. He's playing the victim. Say you're trying to erase the family name." I exhaled slowly. "Let him talk. The truth will surface." She frowned. "That's not a strategy. It's a promise." That evening, my father called again. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Lauren," he said. His voice sounded older, wearier. "What are you doing, cleaning up your mess?" I said. "Your brother's not your enemy," he said. "He's exactly what you raised him to be," I interrupted. "A reflection of you." He sighed heavily. "You think this will end well for you?" "For any of us." "No," I said softly. "But it will end honestly." He didn't reply. I hung up first. The next morning, I walked into Echelon Tower to find the entire floor buzzing. News crews outside, journalists camped by the entrance. I ignored them all and went straight to the boardroom. Marion handed me a tablet. "You might want to see this," she said. It was a live interview. Ethan, sitting in a studio, perfectly groomed, wearing that politician's smile. "The truth is," he said to the camera, "my sister's forgotten where she came from. She's turned our family into her PR stunt. All I'm doing is protecting our father's legacy." I stared at the screen, expression unreadable. Marion waited. "What do we do?" I looked out the glass wall toward the skyline, the city that had watched me rise and now wanted to see if I'd fall. "Nothing," I said finally. He just gave me exactly what I needed. By nightfall, I was sitting in my office with the lights off, the glow of the city reflecting off the glass. On the desk in front of me was a document, proof of Ethan's financial trail, the one he thought he'd buried. I didn't have to ruin him publicly. All I had to do was show the world who he really was. But I hesitated, because in that hesitation, I heard Marion's words echoing, "You sound like him." For a long moment, I didn't move. Then slowly, I picked up the phone and called the SEC. "Compliance Division," I said when they answered. "I'd like to report insider activity under the name Ethan Hayes." The voice on the other end confirmed the details. I gave them everything: dates, accounts, transfers. No hesitation this time. When I hung up, the city outside was glowing silver in the snow. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt empty. Power doesn't taste like victory. It tastes like silence after the storm and the echo of what it cost you to win. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of headlines, calls, and silence. Echelon CEO exposes brother in financial scandal. The Hayes dynasty implodes. Billionaire siblings at war. Every word felt like a knife carved from the truth I had chosen to unleash. By Monday morning, Ethan's name was trending worldwide. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized pending investigation. The SEC had moved faster than I expected. Marion called it swift justice. I called it inevitability. But victory never feels like triumph when the battlefield is your own blood. At 7 a.m., I stood by the window in my office watching the winter light spill across the skyline. The city below moved on trains, cars, people who didn't care about my last name or my family's ruin. I envied them. Marion walked in with 2 coffees. "You didn't go home again," she said. I didn't answer. She set one of the cups down on my desk. "He's gone underground. His lawyer called Ethan's refusing all interviews. Says he's being framed." I gave a hollow laugh. "He's not creative enough to frame himself. You know this will hit your father hard." "I know," I said. By noon, Forbes released a new article. Lauren Hayes and the Fall of the Old Guard. They called me ruthless, brilliant, the silent catalyst of a new financial era. I stared at the words for a long time. Once I would have felt proud. Now they just felt like a mirror I didn't want to look into. Around 2, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I knew the voice immediately. "Lauren." My father's voice was raspier now, weaker, as if it had aged overnight. "We need to talk." I sat down. "About what, Ethan?" "There's nothing left to say." "Yes, there is." He insisted, a low, tired sound in his throat. "He's still my son." "And I'm still your daughter," I said, my voice carefully flat. "But that never seemed to stop you from choosing him." "This isn't about choosing." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "It always was." The connection snapped. The line went dead. I sat with the phone still in my hand, the weight of his final words hanging in the air. The silence was absolute, a void I had created. That evening I drove back to the estate. The air was sharp, the road slick with melting snow. The same iron gates loomed ahead unchanged, as if time had been too afraid to touch this place. James opened the door again, his expression cautious and kind. "They're in the study," he said softly. I nodded and walked in. My father sat in his usual chair by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket. He looked older than his years, a man shrunken by the weight of a crumbling legacy. Ethan stood near the window, staring out at the frozen garden. He looked smaller somehow, pale, unshaven. Deflated. The smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. When he turned to face me, there was no arrogance left, just exhaustion. "Lauren," my father said carefully, his voice strained, "we're a family. Whatever's happened, it doesn't have to end like this." I met his gaze. "You're right. It doesn't." Ethan's voice cracked when he spoke, a thin, fragile sound. "You think I did this for money? You think I care about stocks or shares or any of that? Then why?" I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended. He hesitated, looking at our father. He seemed to search for the right words for a defense he had never learned how to articulate. "Because you already took everything else," he said finally, a raw accusation. I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "The company, the reputation, the name. You built yourself on what you hated most about this family. You think you're different from him, but you're not. You just learned to make it look noble." My chest tightened. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone, Ethan. I did it because someone had to rebuild what you two were burning down." He shook his head, a single bitter motion. "No, you did it to prove you were better." My father stood, leaning heavily on the arm of his chair. "That's enough." Ethan ignored him, his eyes fixed on me, pleading for something I couldn't give him. "You talk about freedom, Lauren, but all I see is obsession. You didn't escape the family business. You just turned it into your reflection." Something inside me snapped. "You stole from me," I said sharply. "From the company I built. You lied. You laundered. You dragged our name through the mud. And you leaked it to the press," he shot back, his voice rising cracked and desperate. "Don't act like your hands are clean." The room went silent except for the slow ticking of the grandfather clock. My father looked between us, his face drawn, his voice a whisper. You two are tearing each other apart. Maybe that's what it takes to break the curse, I said. He sank back into his chair, shaking his head. No, Lauren. That's what it takes to become me. I left before either of them could say another word. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and relentless. It clung to my coat, my hair, my skin, as if trying to quiet everything burning inside me. When I got back to the city, I walked straight into Echelon Tower and up to my office. The lights were dim. The skyline stretched out like a reflection of all the things I couldn't control. Marion was still there waiting. You look like hell, she said gently. Family reunion, I said. Went about as well as you'd expect. She poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed me one. You did the right thing, you know, exposing him. Maybe, I said. But right and good aren't the same thing. She studied me for a long moment. You built all this, she said softly, gesturing around us. And yet you look like you lost everything. I laughed quietly. Maybe I did. At midnight, I turned off my phone, poured another drink, and sat on the floor by the window. Below me, the harbor lights flickered in the dark water, bending and shimmering with every wave. I thought about the word legacy. My father's version meant power control empire. Ethan's meant inheritance entitlement survival. Mine had started as rebellion. Now it was something else entirely, something I wasn't sure I could name anymore. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck 12. The sound echoed across the harbor, low and solemn. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one in particular, How much does it cost to win? The answer, as always, came in silence. Because victory, I was learning, has a bill you never stop paying. Weeks later, the silence broke again on live television. The Christmas lights still lined the streets like constellations, but for me, the season had become an afterthought, a marketing cycle, a fiscal quarter, a distraction. That morning, the sky above Boston was a dull sheet of gray, and the air carried that heavy stillness right before a storm. I didn't know that before the day ended, my life and my family's would once again become the world's entertainment. Marion burst into my office mid-morning, face pale, her phone clutched in her hand. Lauren, she said, breathless, you need to see this. She turned the screen toward me. The image was a still frame from a TV broadcast Forbes Live holiday special. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, Meet the stock market's most private billionaire CEO. My photo professional composed sharp filled the screen. And then the shot widened to reveal the anchor sitting across from my father. For a long second, I didn't move. My pulse hammered in my ears. The world outside my office seemed to fade away. He gave them an interview, Marion said quietly. They're airing it live. The sound of my pulse drowned out everything else. When I turned on the wall screen, his voice filled the office immediately. Calm, deliberate, rehearsed. Lauren's success has been extraordinary, he was saying. I always knew she had potential. What she's achieved with Echelon is impressive. The anchor nodded. There's been tension between you and your daughter in recent months. The Hayes and Comby acquisition, your son's scandal, how does that affect your relationship now? My father gave that same practiced smile I'd seen at 1,000 dinners. Families are complicated, he said smoothly. We've all made mistakes. But we'll come through it stronger. Blood runs deeper than business. A practiced lie wrapped in patriarchal charm. Then came the moment that changed everything. The anchor leaned forward. Mr. Hayes Forbes is set to release their Person of the Year feature tomorrow, and our sources say your daughter is on the cover. Would you like to comment on that? He smiled faintly. I think it's long overdue, he said. But the truth is, she's still learning what leadership really means. Power isn't just about numbers on a screen, it's about people. I hope she remembers that. My hands curled into fists. That single sentence, still learning, was a blade. Subtle, strategic, and devastatingly familiar. I felt the familiar burn of his condescension, the quiet cruelty he'd always used to cut me down. Marion glanced at me. Do you want me to call PR? No, I said, my voice flat. Let him have his moment. Because I knew what was coming next. The camera cut back to the anchor. We actually have some breaking news, she said. Our newsroom has just received an early copy of tomorrow's Forbes issue. Let's take a look. On live television, the image appeared, my face again, this time on the cover. The headline, "Bold Enough to Fill Every Living Room." America. The stock market's most private billionaire CEO. How Lauren Hayes quietly redefined Wall Street. Marion gasped. My father froze on screen, the first crack in his armor finally visible. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. The anchor continued. According to the feature, Echelon AI's valuation just surpassed $40 billion after its latest merger. That makes Ms. Hayes one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the world. The silence in my office was deafening. On screen, my father blinked once, twice, then forced a smile. Well, he said, his voice a little too high, a little too strained. It seems she's done well for herself. And in that pause, just half a second too long, every viewer in the country saw the truth. He hadn't known. The footage spread across every social feed within minutes. Bloomberg, CNN, Yahoo Finance. Clips titled, "When Dad Finds Out on Live TV," racked up millions of views. Hashtags like Forbes cover, Family Feud, and Still Struggling trended for hours. Marion scrolled through the chaos, her expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "You're everywhere," she said. "They're calling it the most awkward live interview of the year." I sat back, exhaling slowly. Let them. The truth's finally public. But even as the adrenaline surged, a quiet ache pulsed beneath it. There was no satisfaction in humiliating him. There was only relief and the faint, bitter taste of inevitability. By late afternoon, the media storm had reached its peak. Forbes called, requesting a follow-up interview. CNBC wanted me for an exclusive. Even Vanity Fair reached out a personal profile piece about resilience, legacy, and power. I declined them all. That evening, I drove home to my father's estate for the first time since the broadcast. The house glowed with golden light against the falling snow, every window flickering with reflections of a family that no longer existed. He was waiting in the study, drink in hand, the television still showing the replay on mute. "You embarrassed me," he said. Voice low. "No," I said, my voice tired. "You did that yourself." He turned toward me, eyes tired but sharp. "You think you've won?" "This isn't a competition, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, but I felt the weariness of a decades-long battle in my bones. "It always was," he said, the old arrogance flickering in his eyes. "You just changed the rules." I stepped closer, my hands in my pockets, refusing to let him see me flinch. "You built your empire under control. I built mine on silence. You used power to be seen. I used it to disappear. But the difference is, I never needed to be loved for it." His hand tightened around the glass. For a moment, I thought he might throw it. Instead, he set it down with deliberate care. "You're your mother's daughter," he said finally. That stopped me. What does that mean? She was brilliant, ruthless, but she never forgave anyone who underestimated her. Not even herself. His voice softened, a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Be careful, Lauren. That kind of fire burns everything." For a flash, I saw the fear in his eyes, not of me, but of what I was becoming. For the first time in years, there was something like sincerity in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or recognition. I turned to leave. "The fire's already burning," I said quietly. "But this time, it's mine." Back in the car, my phone vibrated, nonstop messages from investors, journalists, and strangers. But one text stood out. It was from Marion. Forbes just posted the full interview online. 3 million views in 2 hours. The ending's trending. You should see it. Curious. I opened the link. The clip ended with the anchor reading the article's final line aloud. "In a world obsessed with legacy, Lauren Hayes built her empire not to be remembered, but to be free." Then the anchor smiled at the camera. "And that's the kind of story," she said, "that makes you believe in rewriting your own." The comment section was full of people sharing it, writing things like, "This hit harder than I expected," And she's the definition of earned success. For once, I didn't scroll for hate. I just sat there staring at the screen, feeling something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not victory. Not revenge. Just the quiet relief of knowing I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Outside, the snow fell heavier soft flakes, catching the reflection of city lights like embers cooling after a storm. And for the first time, I let the silence feel like home. The morning after the broadcast, Boston was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm tears through a place and leaves everything unnervingly still. The streets shimmered with leftover ice, the skyline softened by fog, and yet my name was still everywhere. Every phone alert, every headline, every ticker running beneath the morning news. Lauren Hayes, named new CEO of Hayes Global Holdings. I hadn't even made the announcement yet. Marion called at 6 sharp. "It's official," she said. "The board voted overnight. Unanimous. You're in." I sat on the edge of the bed, the sunlight catching the steam rising from my untouched coffee. "So it's done. It's done," she said. Then after a beat, "How do you feel?" Like I just inherited a burning house. "Then let's rebuild it," she said. The first board meeting as CEO wasn't the triumph anyone imagined. It was quiet, tense, the air thick with the weight of too many unspoken things. Most of them had known my father for decades. They still called him Mr. Hayes with reverence. Now they were calling me Ms. Hayes like it was a question mark. I began the meeting with a single sentence. "We're restructuring from legacy to future." Silence. A few skeptical glances. I pressed on. Hayes Global can't keep running on reputation. We need relevance. That means cleaning the house. New ethics, oversight, transparency reports, digital modernization. One of the older members, Samuel Briggs, leaned forward. "Ms. Hayes' tradition is what built this company." I met his gaze. "Tradition is what nearly destroyed it." A flicker of surprise. Marion shot me a quick nod from across the table. I kept going, mapping out a strategy that balanced precision and defiance. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then, one by one, the board members nodded. The motion passed. That night, I walked alone through the empty executive floor of Echelon Tower. The glass walls reflected the city's gold lights, but everything inside felt ghostly, like I was inhabiting someone else's dream. My father's old office was still locked. I hadn't stepped inside since the takeover. I stared at the door for a long time before finally opening it. The scent hit first aged bourbon cedar and the faint trace of cigar smoke. His chair still faced the window, his pen still resting in the tray, as if he'd left in the middle of a thought. On his desk was a single item I hadn't noticed before, a framed photo of us from years ago, me at 16 holding up my first robotics trophy, his hand on my shoulder. He was smiling. I wasn't. I sat down in his chair and stared at that photo until the city outside turned from gold to gray. When I finally got home, there was a package waiting at my door. No return label. Inside, a single sheet of paper folded once with my father's handwriting across it. "You wanted to lead. Now you know the cost. The company is yours. The name is yours. But the legacy will never belong to anyone." Underneath the note was a small velvet box. Inside, his signet ring, gold engraved with the Hayes crest. Heavy. Cold. I turned it over in my palm. The symbol that once meant power now felt like an anchor. The next morning, Marion and I met for breakfast in a cafe near the harbor. Snow fell outside in fine, glittering threads. "You look exhausted," she said. "Feels like I've aged 10 years in a week. You have Forbes calling for a cover interview. CNBC wants an exclusive about the new CEO announcement. Everyone's watching." I stirred my coffee. "I don't want another cover. Let's just do the work." She smiled faintly. "You sound like your old self again." "Maybe I'm trying to find her," I said. By mid-January, the media frenzy began to fade. The scandal headlines gave way to market reports, and for the first time, the focus shifted from my family name to my company's work. Echelon's new AI division, our predictive trading software nicknamed Artemis, was outperforming every algorithm on Wall Street. Investors called it revolutionary. Forbes called it the future. For me, it was redemption. Not for the money, not for the prestige, but for the quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, everything I'd lost had led to something unbreakable. Still, the nights were restless. Some part of me kept replaying my father's words. The legacy will never belong to anyone. One evening, weeks later, I got a call from a number I hadn't seen in months. Ethan. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity or maybe compassion won. Lauren. His voice was rough, strained. They dropped the charges. I know, I said. Congratulations. Silence. Then I'm leaving. Europe. I just wanted to say, he trailed off. What I asked. That I was wrong, he said finally. About everything. I closed my eyes. You weren't entirely wrong. I became more like him than I wanted to admit. You didn't, he said. You did what he couldn't. You turned the name into something worth believing in again. It was the closest thing to peace we'd ever had. Goodbye, Ethan, I said softly. Goodbye, sis. The line clicked. That night I stood on my balcony overlooking the harbor. The snow had stopped and the city shimmered like it was holding its breath. I slipped my father's ring into my pocket, then looked up at the faint glow of stars above the skyline. The legacy he built was a fortress. The one I was building would be a bridge. Behind me, my phone buzzed with a new headline: Forbes declares Lauren Hayes the quiet force behind Wall Street's new era. For once, the word Forbes didn't feel like a label, it felt like closure. I took one last look at the city below, then whispered into the cold night air. Let it all mean something this time. The fire had finally gone out, leaving only the quiet strength of the foundation I'd built from the ashes. I had won the war, and now it was time to build a peace that would last. It was almost spring when I realized the war was finally over. Not the one in the headlines, but the quiet one inside me, the one between the person I used to be and the woman I had become. Boston was thawing, the harbor shedding its icy armor, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to build something that wasn't just for survival. The idea came during a late meeting with Marion. We were reviewing projections for the next quarter when she looked up from her laptop and said, "You've already rebuilt the company. What about rebuilding yourself?" I laughed softly. You make it sound like a side project. I'm serious, Lauren. You've proven your point to your father, to the board, to the entire world. Maybe it's time to do something that doesn't require proving anything. Her words lingered. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window looking out at the lights reflecting off the water, and the thought came as clear as if someone had whispered it. The Lauren Hayes Foundation. Not for prestige, not for redemption, for purpose. The next morning I called Marion before sunrise. I'm doing it, I said. Doing what? Starting a foundation. For women in tech startups, maybe scholarships. Real support, the kind I needed when no one believed in me. There was a pause, then a slow smile in her voice. Now that she said, sounds like legacy. We started small. 3 advisors, 1 assistant, and a single office tucked into the top floor of Echelon Tower. Within a week, word spread faster than we expected. Emails poured and young women pitching ideas, asking for mentorship, seeking seed grants for products that might change the world if someone just gave them a chance. I read every submission, every story. Some were brilliant, others raw, but all of them carried the same pulse I remembered from my early days: hunger, hope, and the quiet terror of believing in yourself before anyone else does. One night after hours of reading applications, I called Marion. This isn't just business, I said. This is personal. I know, she replied. That's why it's going to work. The first grant ceremony was held at the Boston Museum of Contemporary Art. I wore a simple navy dress, the same shade my mother used to favor. The room was filled with young founders, journalists, investors, people who'd once doubted I belonged in their circles. Now they were here to listen. When I stepped up to the podium, I hesitated for a moment, scanning the faces in the crowd. For a flash, I saw my younger self sitting in the back, nervous and visible, clutching a notebook filled with ideas no one would take seriously. This foundation I began isn't about money. It's about belief. Because sometimes the difference between a dream and a company is just one person who refuses to stop believing in it. Applause rippled through the room, but it wasn't the sound that stayed with me. It was the sight of women smiling through tears, nodding like they understood every word. When the event ended, a girl no older than 20 approached me. "Hayes," she said shyly, "I read your Forbes story. My mom said it gave her goosebumps. She told me, 'See, sometimes the quiet ones win.' That made me smile." "Tell your mom she's right," I said, "and so will you." After the event, I drove alone to my parents' old estate. It had been months since I'd gone back. The house was empty now, but the groundskeeper still kept it immaculate. I walked through the silent halls, every step echoing off marble floors. The portraits, the chandeliers, the trophies, it all felt like a museum of ghosts. In my father's study, the fire was long dead. His chair sat empty, the desk bare, except for a single photograph, me, my mother, and Ethan, taken years before everything fell apart. We looked happy. Real unposed, almost ordinary. I sat in that chair again the same way I had after he died and whispered to the room, "I'm not angry anymore." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, more like a release. A week later, I got an unexpected call. "Ethan." "Lauren," he said, his voice steadier this time. "I saw the news about the foundation." "Congratulations." "Thanks," I said. "How's Europe different?" "Calmer. I'm consulting now. Smaller projects. Feels good." "I'm glad," I said. And I meant it. He hesitated before saying, "I know we can't change what happened, but I'm proud of you." It was simple, honest, and it hit harder than I expected. "I'm proud of you too," I said quietly, "for finally finding peace." We didn't say goodbye this time. Just a pause, then the sound of waves in the background, before the line clicked off. 3 months later, the Forbes feature dropped. The headline read, "Lauren Hayes, from family fallout to philanthropic powerhouse." The photo was different this time. No suit, no boardroom. Just me in jeans, sitting on a park bench with my laptop and coffee, the city skyline behind me. The caption read, "She built empires, then built bridges." The article ended with a quote from me that I barely remembered giving. "Power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about deciding who gets to speak next." When I read that, I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one fighting to be heard. I was the one making space for others. That evening, Marion came by the office with 2 glasses of champagne. "To new beginnings," she said, clinking her glass against mine. "To better endings," I corrected. We drank, laughed, and watched the lights of the harbor dance against the dark water. Outside, Boston pulsed with life-young founders, late-night coders, dreamers, chasing something bigger than themselves. And for the first time in years, I wasn't chasing. I was standing still, watching the world I'd helped shape start to move on its own. The city had become my family, the foundation of my inheritance. And in the reflection on the glass, I finally saw her, the woman I had spent a lifetime trying to become. Not my father's daughter, not my brother's rival, just me, Lauren Hayes. And this time, that was enough. The air in Boston carried that rare kind of calm that comes after a long storm. Spring had finally arrived, but it wasn't just the city thawing, it was me. A year had passed since the Christmas dinner that had changed everything, the night when Ethan mocked me with "still struggling" and Forbes called me the stock market's most private billionaire CEO. A year since the silence that followed turned into applause. A year since I stopped proving myself to anyone but me. That morning I woke early as always. Old habits never really die, they just evolve. I made coffee in the small stainless steel kitchen of my Beacon Hill apartment, still the same one I'd lived in before everything shifted. Success hadn't made me crave marble floors or private jets. It made me crave peace. Outside, the city was waking up. Buses rumbled past the cobblestone streets, students hurried to class, and somewhere a street violinist was playing Clair de Lune. For the first time in years, I wasn't hurrying anywhere. I was right where I needed to be. My calendar that day had one major event circled in red: the Lauren Hayes Foundation First Anniversary Summit. I smiled at the handwritten note under it, "Dreamers Welcome." At the venue, a renovated library downtown, the staff was setting up for the press conference. Reporters milled around, microphones and cameras ready. Marian approached, tablet in hand, calm as ever. "Are you ready for round 2 with Forbes?" she teased. I smirked. "As long as no one's spilling wine this time." She laughed. "They're doing a follow-up feature. This time, they want to talk about what's next. Not the scandal, not the fall, just the future." "Good," I said. "It's about time we start talking about what we built, not what we survived." The summit began quietly intentional, human, humble. No dramatic music, no spotlight reveal. Just entrepreneurs, students, and innovators who had been touched by the foundation's grants. One by one, they took the stage to share their stories: a single mother who launched a fintech startup from her garage, a refugee who built an app connecting small farmers to investors, a group of college girls who created an AI for early cancer detection. As they spoke, I realized each story was a mirror, reflections of who I'd been when I started. Hungry, overlooked, unbelieved. When it was my turn to speak, the lights dimmed. I stepped forward, not as the billionaire CEO Forbes named, but as the woman who'd once stood in a grocery store line with food stamps in her hand, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "When I was 25, I began. I thought success was something you achieved once and then you were done. But it's not. Success is a conversation between who you were and who you're becoming. It's messy, it's lonely, and it rarely looks the way you expect." I paused, scanning the crowd. Dozens of young faces were fixed on me. Some were nodding, some were crying. "People like to tell you that revenge is sweet," I continued. "But the sweetest revenge is peace. It's sitting at a table full of people who once doubted you and realizing you don't need their approval anymore." The applause was gentle at first, then it grew steady, warm, honest. When the noise quieted, I added softly, "If you're still struggling, you're not failing. You're just building quietly. Keep building." After the summit, as the crowd dispersed, Marian walked up and handed me her phone. "Your brother's on the line," she said quietly. "Ethan." For a moment I hesitated. Then I took the phone and stepped out into the crisp air. "Lauren," his voice came steadier now, softer. "I just watched your speech online. Did I do okay?" I asked lightly. "You did more than okay," he said. "You were real. I'm proud of you." The words hit differently this time, not because I needed them, but because I knew he meant them. "Thank you," I said. "How are you doing?" "I'm good. Taking it slow. Madison and I are rebuilding. Smaller house, simpler life." "That sounds good for you," I said. "It is," he replied then after a pause. "Dad would have been proud too." I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But that's not what I live for anymore." "I know," he said. "That's what makes you different." We didn't talk long, just enough to know the past didn't hold us hostage anymore. When we hung up, I stared out at the harbor. The water glimmered gold in the late sunlight. The same view I'd had during the darkest nights of my startup years. Except now, it didn't feel like a reminder of isolation. It felt like home. That evening, I walked to the Charles River Esplanade alone. The city was glowing, music spilling from restaurants, laughter from college kids echoing under the bridges. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, breathing in the cool air, and pulled out my phone. On the Forbes homepage, a new headline appeared: "Lauren Hayes, from silent CEO to global mentor." The first line read, "Once mocked for her quiet ambition, Hayes has built not just a company but a movement, turning struggle into structure and success into something worth sharing." I smiled. The irony wasn't lost on me. The magazine that once made my family's jaws drop was now celebrating what they'd never understood: that power isn't about status, it's about purpose. As the city lights flickered across the water, I took off my ring, the silver one Dad had given me on my college graduation day. I held it between my fingers. thinking about all the versions of me it had witnessed: the frightened girl, the rejected founder, the quiet CEO, the woman who learned to forgive. Then, with a deep breath, I placed it gently into the river. It sank slowly, catching the reflection of the streetlights, before disappearing into the current. Not a gesture of anger, of release. Walking back, I passed a cafe window where two young women were huddled over a laptop, whispering excitedly, sketching ideas lost in the glow of possibility. I smiled, remembering myself at their age. They didn't notice me, of course. That was the beauty of it. They didn't need to, because now the world had room for them. And that was all I ever wanted. When I got home, I opened my laptop and wrote the final note for the Foundation Journal, a tradition I'd started to document lessons for future founders. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you set in motion. Share your knowledge. Invest in people. Lead quietly. And when they ask how you did it, just smile and keep building. I hit save, then closed the laptop. The city outside was alive and bright, a chorus of new beginnings. I poured a small glass of wine, yes, red, and raised it toward the window. To peace, I whispered. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't celebrating survival. I was celebrating freedom. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me. Tell me your story. The one where they doubted you and you proved them wrong by simply becoming yourself. Like, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. You're not behind. You're just building quietly. And one day when your moment comes, the world will finally realize you were never struggling. You were rising.